Welcome back to the InfoSec and Nelson Show. This is episode 67. Today we have Evan Francen on. Evan is the CEO of two security companies, the host of the Unsecurity podcast, as well as the chief designer of S2 Square, which is essentially a simple way to communicate risk with non-technical folks. My three main takeaways from conversation were: one, what a CISO's job actually is when you boil it down; two, how to choose a risk methodology that's right for you; and three, some of the intricacies involved in secure password management. You'll enjoy those two things, plus a bunch of other tips along the way. And now, here's my conversation with Evan. Evan Francen, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
So who are you and what do you do?
I try to keep that secret, man. I'm a security guy. Well, I'm Evan Francen, CEO and co-founder of two companies. One's a really good high-end boutique information security consulting company called FR Secure. And the other one is a software as a service platform called Security Studio.
So under the umbrella of Security Studio, you talk to a lot of state CISOs. What's the biggest issue they struggle with?
I think the biggest issue they struggle with is they're playing a game that they can't win. And I think they're realizing that. Meaning, in a state, there are so many moving parts, so many moving components. My own home state here in Minnesota, 92 government agencies in the state, 87 counties, 800 some odd, cities and municipalities, and you have a small team who's responsible for securing all that. The right way, I think the new way of thinking about things is what we call distributed accountability. It's bringing those other players into the game to play with you as opposed to you trying to do it all alone. I think that's their biggest struggle. They feel alone.
Can you dig down a bit? What is the distributed accountability model? How does that work?
Sure. Yeah. So if you take like the state of Minnesota, or any really big entity, take Cargill or any large organization, it's really made up of a bunch of smaller organizations. So in distributed accountability, it's identifying and finding what those smaller organizations are, naming people to be responsible for the security of those smaller, entities. And then instead of, what we've done before, which is, making them do things, instead we empower them. We give them autonomy to tell us how they want to manage security in their little piece of the world, and then boil that all up into single dashboards, single methodologies, things like that. But it's getting other people to play the game with us, and at the same time, making them aware of what their responsibilities are.
Yeah, how does that autonomy work? Where they're saying what they want to do, how they want to handle security, and then we're kind of enforcing a minimum standard that they have to live up to. How would that work?
Yeah, so I like simple. Bruce Schneier said it best a while back, and I know somebody else said it prior to that, but he said that complexity is the worst enemy of security. And when you think about that, that's some really good wisdom. So when you look across an enterprise, it's making things simple for people as much as possible, deploying a single methodology that they will understand. The other approach, yesterday I was speaking with some Cornell University, and that's even more challenging because you've got such different personalities within a large university. And, take research faculty, for instance, trying to get them to play by your rules. Well, there's two problems with that. One, as the CISO, I don't understand what it's like to walk in your shoes, what it's like to do your job. So, implementing or instituting some sort of control that I don't know how it's going to affect you really won't work. So instead, it's let's bring you into the discussion and have you do your own risk assessment of your own department using, a unified methodology. And then you make the risk decisions. You tell me what risks are acceptable to you as the business and what risks are not. And then I'll help you get those things implemented. So really a CISO's job in the most simple and the most simplified, explanation is just two things. I consult the business on information security risk so that they'll make good risk decisions. And then I implement those risk decisions to the best of my ability. One of the things I don't do, and you want to make sure that no CISOs do this, is make risk decisions on behalf of the business.
Okay, so those decisions should be coming from the departments then.
Whoever represents the business. So if you had a CEO, for instance, or a provost in a university who was authoritarian, in their management style of the organization, you could have them make the risk decisions, but in most cases, they're somewhat ignorant about what their responsibility is, so they'll defer it down to the department level.
Okay, and then from the department level, what are the fundamentals that they should be focusing on to lower the risk?
Well, number one, you can't protect the things you don't know you have, right? So asset management, asset inventories, hardware, software, and data. Where is it? Where does it go? Understanding that first, and then determining what the appropriate controls are. We talk about, access control, password management, configuration control. Too often we go there before we did the inventory piece. So that would be the fundamental number one.
There's mapping out what you have, and then once you know what you have, then you can figure out each of those, how to secure each of those components.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot we've done right with the state with that attack surface mapping I was telling you about.
Okay, yeah, that would be critical, because very often, I don't know how it works on the state level, but in company level, very often someone they'll spin up some EC2 instance that gets forgotten about and subsequently never patched, and then that ends up becoming the easiest avenue to attack to gain access to the enterprise.
Absolutely. Can't tell you how many times in an incident response when we've been told by the client that they had no idea. They had no idea, one, that it was there, or they assumed that they were protected against it when it was obvious they weren't.
Now, do you do the asset inventory, or do you bring in someone else for that?
So on this, it depends. So on the Security Studio, we don't do any managed services. It's just the software. On the FR Secure side, they do help with asset inventory. It depends on when we're called in. If we're called in on an incident response, threat hunting might be part of that, and then through that you would probably get an asset inventory as well. But it all depends on how we've been engaged.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. You mentioned before about figuring out a risk methodology, a risk assessment methodology that kind of works for everyone, and there are many. Do you have any suggestions on how to figure out which one, like how an organization can choose which one is right for them?
Yeah, number one, keep it simple, right? I think so often we get get this analysis paralysis where you're looking for something perfect or something that's going to be better than all the others. In truth, the one that's best is the one that fits, the one that communicates to you, to management, what the current state of security is, what the future state might be. So it's imperative that it's measurable and simple, right? Not everybody, actually, almost everybody isn't an information security expert. So treat it that way. The methodology we created and advocate is called S2 score. And yesterday I was on the phone with CIS. They're good friends of ours, the Center for Internet Security, and they have their own tool called CSAT. And the reason why I was talking to them is I don't want to argue about which tool is better, because that we do that too often in our industry. Instead, what I want to know is how can I translate your tool into mine and vice versa, so that a customer, it's like languages, right? We argue about, is German better than English, better than Spanish, better than French, better than Hebrew? That's an irrelevant discussion. What we need to do is be able to translate between them all.
So the risk methodology should be able to translate between the organization, or at least the technical team, to non-technical people to be able to understand the risk.
Yeah, yep, exactly. And ultimately up to executive management, who is, whether they know it or not, they are the ones who are ultimately responsible.
Okay, now one of the things that we've had to deal with over the last year or so, and I think you mentioned this before the call, is that essentially we're the CEO of the security in our own home, and very often we bring work to the home now. How do we teach better security habits?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. What we're trying to do is trying to motivate people for their own sake, their own benefit. As a company trying to help people at home, we could do training and awareness programs and things like that. That's the traditional way we've done it. But in our training and awareness programs, we've so often told the employees that work at home how to protect the company, not how to protect themselves. And so I think we need to flip the script on that and not use fear so much. Try to figure out ways to do it more incentive-based. We're working with a couple of banks that are considering giving people better interest rates on loans and deposits if they score well on our assessment that we developed. Yeah, it's going to be a long road, and make it free. Our S2Me tool that we deployed to the state of North Dakota recently, it's free. It's always going to be free. There's no catch. And so many of the things in our industry have a catch.
Okay, and then so you're giving them a questionnaire, and then based on how they answer on the questionnaire, that gives them a security score. And then based on that, the decision is made of like interest rates and whatever they get from the bank?
Yep. And so the bank is considering, they haven't done it yet, but I think they will. They don't really care what your score is. They just want to know that you took the time to go through something, to learn something about information security. It's a combination of a questionnaire, and then we're moving to what's called an instant S2Me. So all you essentially need to do is, once you create the account, we're going to give you an automatic score based on the things that we can determine just from you being there.
Okay, so you're seeing like browser, anything you can run via JavaScript, any other interesting information points that you can grab from that?
Yeah, so when you create your password, we'll run that through an algorithm. We won't store your password, but we'll run it through an algorithm to determine how strong it is, whether it's been compromised before, how popular it is, a number of those things. And then I think there's like 5 or 6 other characteristics beyond, browser things. I think one is when you sign up with because one of the things in that tool is, essentially where do you live, because physical aspects of security have to be taken into account. When you put in your zip code, we'll pull crime rate data for that area and natural threat disasters or natural threat data. It's a combination of a bunch of things.
Okay, now you brought up an interesting point, and it kind of, I guess, is one of my pet peeves, right? Where you put in, there's like this password strength meter, and they're kind of all over the place. Very often you'll see ones that you'll get like the very strong password if you've got one capital, one lowercase, one number, one and one non-alphanumeric character, and it's got to be minimum 8, and that's kind of not a very strong password. And traditionally, as a pen tester, whenever we came across apps that had that, we'd put in a password 1, and if it needed a non-alphanumeric character, you put password 1 and then exclamation point. It's very difficult to actually gauge the difficulty of a password, even if when you have things that are minimum. Like if you based on the length, right? Even then you can sometimes run into issues, especially if there's a breach and the password is stored in something like MD5, then even if you've got a 20 character long password, if you have enough GPUs, you're going to still crack that anyway. So how do you gauge the strength of a password properly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll bring up I'm going to try to find while we're talking the algorithm. It's pretty complicated. That's where we try to keep the complication away from the user, because complicated isn't necessarily bad. It is if you can manipulate it and it confuses people. I'm trying to find.
Yeah, I always find like passwords are such a, I guess, I don't want to say fickle, but it's very easy to tell somebody the end. And I see this on LinkedIn all the time. They'll have these charts that say, if your password is this length, then it'll take this many hundreds or thousands of years to crack. But it really doesn't take into consideration other factors that would actually make it very simple to crack. So they're kind of like, especially if there's password reuse, and where it was reused, that got hacked, and that was stored, like I said, in something like a SHA-1, SHA-2, or MD5, and that's cracked pretty easily. And then you're just doing a credential stuffing attack against your target, and you're going to crack what would otherwise be a very secure password, but then it becomes weak.
Well, right, exactly. So it's not the password itself that was weak; it's the management of it that was weak, right? It was storing it in clear text in the database, or like you said, MD5, something easily. We can find the collision fairly easily. but the password itself was constructed well. And that's one of the challenges. I could have the best password ever, but anybody that I sign up with, that I give my password to, if they're following crappy practices, well, then it kind of nullifies all the work I did on the front end. We've got 18 rules.
Yeah, you're completely dependent on, like, you can try to secure everything you have as good as possible, but you're basically dependent on who you're doing business with, right? And this is something I came across today. I think I posted about this, but you sent a sensitive email to another company and they became ransomware. And now ransomware gangs are disclosing, if you don't pay the ransom, they just disclose all the sensitive data you had in your organization. So while you took care of everything you needed to do, somebody you did business with didn't, and then you're leaking sensitive data. So same thing with passwords. So yeah, you were saying you have 18 different checks you do?
Yeah, 18 rules. Rule number 1 is length. Rule number 2 is, these are some of these are standard, but then it gets a little bit funky. So rule number 2, only numbers. That has a weight. Only lowercase letters has a weight. Only uppercase letters have a weight. Only letters with only letters short, and these are all if they're shorter than 16 characters. Mix of letters and numbers is a weight. Number of times this password was compromised in a breach is a weight. The password, a dictionary is a weight. A dictionary with simple obfuscation is a weight. 80% of the password is a word that exists in the dictionary. 80% of the word exists in the dictionary with simple obfuscation, and then 60%. Password's a double word, contains common sequences from a keyboard, like QWERTY and what have you. Numeric sequences based on well-known numbers such as 911. Word with numbers appended, and contains anything related to personal, so things that we can derive about you personally. So 18 rules that go into the password, and it depends on, how the weights are applied. It gets even more complicated. But yeah, it's definitely more than just how long is it.
Yeah, it sounds like that. And are there any intentions to align with NIST or with OWASP ASVS?
No, I don't trust them. Yeah, we'll probably map to them. It does help with the credibility, but beyond that, probably not much more. On this particular point.
Okay, there's been a lot of discussion on the ASVS mailing or GitHub project now about how to handle passwords. And one of the things that I heard you talk about on your podcast was the advantages of forcing users to update passwords periodically. And then I guess from my standpoint, one of the things that I've come across as a pen tester when doing a brute force attack, very often, if I have a password that I've seen that user use, and in general, when you've got a web app that forces a template to the password and forces a number, the number is almost always at the end. The capital letter is almost at the beginning. And if they are forcing every 6 months to update the password, then that number generally just gets rotated and they don't create an actually new password. It's just a password that's based on the previous one. And then when you do if you're doing a brute force, creating rules that will rotate passwords like that through something like a Hashcat, or if you're doing it through a web app, doing it through a burp intruder, is generally pretty easy to be able to still brute force the password. So what are your thoughts on the advantages of why it's good to force password updates?
Well, I think, from a risk perspective, risk is likelihood and impact, right? So the longer a password lives, the longer anything lives, just logically, the more likely it becomes it's going to die or get compromised or get hurt. There's that function that's hard to quantify, but it's definitely true. If I share my password with somebody else, it's that somebody else that I have to trust. It doesn't matter how well I've protected my password. I may have never shared it with anybody. I used a strong password manager. My wife doesn't even know my passwords, but I did share it with somebody. I shared it with whoever it is that I'm authenticating with, because the way most authentication works, as you know, is I'm not sharing a hash of my password. I'm sharing my actual password, and then you're hashing it. And then you're comparing your hash, hopefully, with what you have in the database.
Hopefully.
Yeah, right?
I was going to say the majority of breaches that we see at BreachSense, the hashes are MD5, SHA-1, SHA-2. You'll see some bcrypt, almost never see Argon2 IDs, but I would say the majority are using weak hashing algorithms.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
in addition to the ones that don't use any and it's just plain text.
which is inexcusable. I mean, this is the year 2021. It's just so lazy to not try to secure the password on behalf of your customer. And I have zero tolerance.
Definitely. So anyway, so you were saying, so you share the password with nobody knows it but you and the organization hopefully saves it in a hashed format, so they only see it when you authenticate, and then they do their hashing to compare it with. But I think I cut you off there.
Oh no, I think I think the simplest answer is just the longer a password is in existence, the higher the likelihood that it will be compromised one way or another.
Okay. So I've seen, and logically it definitely makes sense. I guess the question comes down to, in practice, and then it would also take, I guess, more dedication. So if you're just doing a credential stuffing attack and replaying other passwords you've seen, then you're not doing any alterations to that password, then you would miss it. If it's more targeted, or if you're playing with some of the hashcat rules, or what I like to do is, if you're brute forcing a target, you can generate rules using hashcat, take that into a file and put that into Burp Intruder to do a brute force attack if it's a web app attack. And then you can start just doing rotations or taking the dictionary words and then doubling it, or slicing off letters in various places and rotating them to see what happens. But it's pretty easy to take, if you've got a base password, and then just to add different suffixes or prefixes and play around with it based on a base string that was used, and then automating that is pretty simple.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could go for that.
Do you think passwords will be here in another 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah. Yep, I do. I've been in this industry for so long, and we're still fighting the same fights. It's crazy, man. We're 30 years I've been doing security stuff, and we're still trying to get people to do asset management, for crying out loud. So yeah, passwords will still be here. It's the cheapest form. I mean, so much of what's driven is, economic reasons, right? It's easier for me to implement a simple password authentication scheme. And it's so well socialized. Everybody knows what a password is. They don't like it, but they know it. And they're not going to not sign up for your service if they have to create a password typically. So yeah, it's here for a while, for sure.
Here for the foreseeable future. Yeah, and I always find that even the other options or methods, right? So using biometrics today, at least, is still based on a password, meaning you initially authenticate using a password, and then afterwards you can use your biometric based on the fact that you put in a password beforehand. So there's very few instances, at least that I've seen, that it's solely based on something that's not a password.
Right.
To authenticate.
And the thing that scares me about, or concerns me, it doesn't really scare me, but the things that concern me about biometrics, if my password is compromised, I can create a new password, right? I can nullify the value of that password by changing it to something else. With a biometric, if whoever you're trusting with this authentication, if they've done it right, they're not storing the actual image of your biometric. They're storing the minutia, mathematical representations of it that you can't rebuild it, almost like a hash for biometrics. But we've seen people store the entire image. So then if you're doing that and you get my fingerprint, I can't make a new fingerprint. So that's a concern I haven't seen addressed enough to make me feel comfortable with it.
Definitely. How'd you get started in InfoSec?
Oh, yeah, like I think a lot of us back, in the 90s, I was working in a warehouse, and I was the warehouse manager. This is a weird story, a big part of my salary came to overtime. Well, this company was just beginning getting into technology. So they hired their first ever CIO, and this was 1990. And they were going to cut my overtime. So I was like, well, I'm quitting, Well, the CIO noticed that I had some technical skills, because I had always been a hacker. I mean, did a lot of things that, I didn't get paid for, but I got a lot of bragging rights. So I was technical when he offered me a position on his team. And then, I started really being more of a Cisco guy, because we didn't really have security teams then. We didn't really have cybersecurity. Information security really wasn't a job. It's just kind of considered as part of everything you do. But I started out being a Cisco guy and knew networks really well. And one thing led to another, and here I am.
With 2 companies. So I wanted to ask you about that. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to start a security company?
Ooh, well, number one, don't. No, I'm just kidding. It depends on, what you want to accomplish. So we're very mission driven. Mission gets us through everything. It gets us through the highs, the lows. It differentiates us from other organizations. We live it. We love when people challenge us about that because, you obviously get that, like, oh yeah, you say your mission before money, but you make money. Well, that's not what I said. We focus on the mission, we will make money. If we focus on the money, we won't make the mission. So it's having a mission, a purpose. For me, that made a huge difference in all the ebbs and flows of doing business. There's tons of opportunity. Look for areas that ideally, you look for areas that other people aren't servicing. Security Studio focuses on our underserved markets, meaning state and local government, K-12, education, higher ed, small to mid-sized businesses, and people at home. Those are all underserved markets. So I look for something that you can actually solve, and whatever you do not take advantage of other people, because then you make yourself an enemy of people like me and others. Get your priorities straight, I guess.
What does Security Studio do?
We're a software as a service company, and we defined what we think is a common language. Now, anybody who's going to boast that their language is any better than anybody else's, I think is, again, it's a moot point. So we created an information security language that can be spoken by our markets. Which it ends up being everybody, right? We create an S2 score. We do simplified information security risk assessments, all automated on the platform that are consistent. The platform also helps people build security roadmaps in a way that it's not intimidating. And just this morning, I was talking to a CISO, and he was almost afraid to ask me a question because he felt intimidated by asking the question. I'm like, dude, that's a big problem. You ask me any question you want to. So it's that kind of platform. It's solely focused on helping you build the best security program you can build without having to, pay a security expert $300, $400, $500 an hour.
Yeah, I like the common language, which is something that I see all the time as well. You'll have the very technical folks who speak one language, and then the executive team, and there's just a mismatch there, and messages don't get conveyed properly, and then decisions aren't made properly as a result. So having everyone kind of on the same team speaking the same language is definitely key.
Yeah, I think so. And because as a CISO, and we were talking about this before we started the podcast, the CISO only has two jobs. Don't overcomplicate this. Your job is to advise the business to the best of your ability, consult the business to make good risk decisions. They make risk decisions, not me. The second thing is once they've made those risk decisions, implement those risk decisions to the best of your ability. That's basically it. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that fits underneath those two things, but you got to get the business involved.
Definitely. Great advice. All right, Evan Francen, we're at time. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Josh. And I love working with you. I know you and I are both working together, as part of a similar business group. And it's just cool to see you on there and be a part of it with you, man.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening and leaving reviews. And if you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'm @Jamoose on Twitter, or drop me an email at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you're part of a security team that needs visibility into your employees, customers, or third-party suppliers' breach credentials before criminals exploit them, head on over to breachsense.io to apply for a free 7-day trial. That's it for this week, and I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.